first Sunday monthly service. This is the North Texas Church of Freethought. If you meant to go to some other church, now's the time. Otherwise, you may wind up really being dark and heck. Anyway, it's July 2nd, 2017. July 2nd, 1937, exactly 80 years ago, was the last that Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, were heard from. As they were trying to complete one of the final legs of their world flight equatorial circumnavigation of the globe. They were expected to land at Howland Island. They were taken off from Lae here in Papua New Guinea, and were completing this leg up to Howland Island. And they were supposedly in the vicinity, as judged by radio contact and the strength of the signal and so forth, but they never arrived. And it was speculated that they somehow got off course and landed on one of these Phoenix Islands, specifically Gardner Island, a very tiny little place that was uninhabited at the time, also known as Miku Maroro, now part of the island nation of Kiribati. Who ever heard of the nation of Kiribati before? See, you learned something new here. And the Phoenix Islands, which is actually a protected area, and the square area of that protected area, those Phoenix Island, is approximately that of the area of California. So we're talking about a big place. The Pacific Ocean is a big, big place. Yes?
Did you help me figure out exactly where we are in the map? Or my geography is awful. So.
Here's Australia down here.
Okay.
Okay. And that's Papua New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, and then Hawaii is a bit higher up. Here's Samoa, in case you wondered where that is, Fiji, and New Zealand is down here, and here's New Caledonia. So.
And what is it that you got the United States under the Howland and Baker? Those
because that's U.S. territory.
It is. I've never heard of it.
Yep, absolutely. Anyway, there's a lot of mystery still connected with Earhart's disappearance, including whether the proximity of the international date line might have had something to do with it as they're navigating through here. Now, Noonan was an experienced navigator, but still, this is a really screwed up area. And I found a place online that said that for a couple of hours each day, there's actually 3 different dates going on here. You know, like July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd all together, right? Because when you cross the international date line, this is really interesting. This is as interesting as a calendar, don't you think, Marlon? It's really screwball-y. I emailed you a picture of the international date line. The way it goes through Upper Michigan, part of Upper Michigan is in one time zone, and the rest of it's in a different time zone. Do you think they would have make it match the border between Upper Michigan and Wisconsin at that point? Howland is today part of the U.S. Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. Wouldn't you like to go to this national monument? Boy, I would. It was established in January of 2009. Of course, it's not very easy to get to because they haven't built a bridge to it yet. But it might be a good reason to get a job with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or maybe the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They might send you there and you could do some science or sacrifice on the beach. So, July 2nd, 1962, that was the date the first Walmart store was opened at Rogers, Arkansas. How exciting, huh? And in 1964, that was the day that President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Interestingly, it's not hard to find people, libertarians very often, and sometimes libertarian freethinkers, because I've met some who think that the Civil Rights Act was wrong, that you should be able to discriminate against anybody you want, refuse to sell or service them. Kind of like with the business of the bakers, should they have to make a wedding cake for gays who are getting married. On that view, of course, the businesses who would discriminate are just only going to hurt themselves, so then they go out of business. And I never really saw that made sense. I think you would have, because there were back in the 1950s. You read some accounts of these like traveling bands, and one of them was Jewish or too dark of a skin and had to sleep out in the car. They wouldn't let him go in there. So, interested in your thoughts on this, and I think here's a really values issue, and you don't see very many churches on the right side of these kinds of things, in my view. July 2nd is also World UFO Day, because supposedly this is when the saucer crashed, the Roswell incident in New Mexico. And lastly, on this day, in 1776, the Second Continental Congress approved a resolution to declare the colonies independent of the Kingdom of Great Britain. In a letter dated the following day, July 3rd, John Adams wrote to his wife about this historic event, and here's what he said to her. The second day of July will be the most memorable in the history of America. I have to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations. A great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated, God, blah, blah. But pomp and parade, shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, fireworks, I guess, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. Wow, and of course we still celebrate July 2nd, right? As the nation's birthday, because that's when they voted. Oh, what? So why isn't it today? Because July 4th is what they put on the Declaration, because July 4th is when they actually approved the words, the text that were used. And this relates somewhat to our subject today of religious liberty. And you might ask, why is that? Because most Americans think of religious liberty as something that was invented here, made in America. They think of the colonists as people who were fleeing religious persecution in Europe and found religious liberty here in America, where it remains a foundational element of our society and its political institutions, something that we're all devoted to, every single American. Well, of course, the truth is more complicated than that, and the details offer some important insights and food for thought on this subject, and also prospects for religious liberty in the future and around the world, and more about that in just a few minutes. Here's our creed. We're ready to rethink it, rewrite it, re-say it anytime. It used to be longer, and we really, over the years, boiled it down to this. So I invite your thoughts about that. Just a nice way to say what we're about. Please check our website at churchoffreethought.org. How many of you newcomers have been to our website? Okay, cool. And there's bulletins and stuff going there back to 2008. There's a forum under the services section. Not very active, but there are some jokes I put in there, so feel free to post your ideas and comments. And then like our Facebook page and sign up for our Twitter feed. The addresses are on the back side of the bulletin, which, as we were saying earlier, is great for a 10% discount at restaurants that offer that. Next month's service is August 6th, and our own Jim Majors, who I guess is out of town today, but he's going to be presenting. He had formerly been a kind of a really zealot type of Christian, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship with Jesus type of person. And he's going to tell us how things unraveled for him when he began looking more closely at what he was supposed to think and believe, or perhaps more accurately, what he was supposed to believe or what he was supposed to not think about. Jim's going to help us understand how he learned that. The devil is in the details. Kit is, where are you, Kit? Oh, she's not here.
Not here.
Oh, I thought she did arrive. Well, anyways, she was going to be with our younger freethinkers. Somebody else would pitch in for that. This is a job that is not babysitting, believe me. Our young freethinkers need food for thought. Most of us, I would say, struggle through years of trying to make sense of all the crazy superstition and nonsense with which we're confronted in the world. We need volunteers to rotate taking on that important responsibility. Some of you teach kids as a living. Many hands make short work. If you had 3 or 4 people doing it, it'd only be every 3rd or 4th month that we do that. And of course, if you do have work with kids, you've had kids, you know how tremendously rewarding that is, an opportunity to share yourself and your insights with young people who really welcome that and have so much to learn about how to be good and thoughtful people. Of course, we never know how many or what ages of children might be brought. We don't even have any today, so I guess they're all swimming or something. So who's going to do this during the August service? I suppose Kid will go up against it. She's getting on it today. And you're ready anytime too, Marvin. And Cody, is that?
Yeah, I'm 7.
Terrific. Well, we appreciate that. We're always looking for people to volunteer for other things too, things that you think of. It's not like we're going to tell you, crack the whip. This is an all-volunteer organization. Nobody gets paid for doing that. Even John, our videographer, has been doing this for years. Nobody's paying him to do that, but it's important. And if there's something you think there's important that's not being done, then by golly, let's do it. And why don't you spearhead that? We've had a book club, for example, on and off, so you don't mind leading that. People will show up. If you build it, it will show up. So that's the future of free thought. Every one of those kids is an atheist, just think. No, stop. All right, so we have a moment of science today. This is kind of a recurring item. We don't always have it, but we have one today. And the conquest of Mars. Of course, as you know, that this time of year we celebrate the independence of the first new nation in what was then at least considered the New World, the Americas. I've tried to look into, I really do think we were the first one outside of Europe after the Americas were discovered. The first major colony, certainly to revolt against colonial rule, successfully set up its own government. But if you're 20 years old or less, there's another place, another new world. Hello, Kit. Now everybody knows who Kit is because you remember coming a little late. There's another place, another new world, where people, more accurately, their emissaries, machines, have been continuously active, and that's the planet Mars. Many of us here remember, you know, maybe if I turn on one of these front lights, that'll be a little more visible. So many of us here remember when Pathfinder probe landed on Mars, July 4th, 1997. The following year, also on July 4th, Japan launched its Nozomi probe to Mars, but unfortunately Nozomi had fuel problems and failed to achieve orbital insertion. So there have been altogether 44 missions to Mars, 21 by the United States. 6 of those NASA missions were failures, and you may remember those also. Mariner 3, that was way back in 1964, the Shroud failed to jettison, was being launched, I guess. There was a launch failure of Mariner 8. The Mars Observer was lost in 1992. The Mars Climate Orbiter, lost on arrival at Mars. And I believe that's the one where there was some mix-up about whether they were measuring distances in meters or miles or kilometers or something. Yeah, so total screw-up on our part. And then in 1999, the Mars Polar Lander with its Deep Space 2 probes, that counts as actually 2 missions, was lost on arrival. The other 15 missions to U.S. missions to Mars were successful, beginning with Mariner 4, which reached Mars on July 14th, 1965. That was before the Apollo moon landings. This was the first picture of another world taken from deep space, not from a telescope near the Earth. And Mariner 4 was able to determine that Mars has a thin atmosphere. That's how early we were able to figure that out. 22 pictures were returned to Earth as it flew by. The first pictures taken of another planet, deep space. As I said, it took about a week for those pictures to be transmitted back to Earth, not because of the time delay, but just crunching the data. The Curiosity rover on Mars, in contrast, which landed August 6, 2012, now transmits data about 250,000 times faster than Mariner 4 did. Well, there's a total of 8 NASA missions that are active right now. Mars Odyssey entered orbit in October 2001. The Mars Express orbiter in 2003. The Spirit rover landed in January 4th, 2004. And the Spirit and Opportunity both returned hundreds of thousands, not 22 pictures, hundreds of thousands of spectacular, high-resolution, full-color images of Mars. Curiosity rover landed in 8/6/2012. This is the biggest one yet. It's a car. It's the size of a small car. It has a 7-foot arm. It has 17 cameras. It has a laser. It has a drill. And also it has this system called Electra, which is beginning, and you see some of these other ones too have this. It's an electronic communication system, radio communication system, which actually sets up a sort of internet at Mars so that the different machines can talk to one another and know where each other are. It helps the NASA people figure out what's going on. They can reprogram some of these devices from the Earth using this relay system. It's really amazing. The MAVEN orbiter, that's the Mars Atmospheric Venting Experiment, and because now that we know that Mars has an atmosphere, and we think it had more in the past, we're interested in how quickly the atmosphere is being lost today. And that also has this Electra communication. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter also has the Electra telecommunication, and it can support actually information being sent from the rovers too. The rovers on the far side of Mars, one of the satellites orbiting Mars, can pick up the data and transmit it to Earth. And also the ExoMars orbiter, and that's in cooperation with the European Space Agency and the Russian Space Agency, and it has a Schiaparelli landing demo that was supposed to go down but was lost on descent. So now let's pause to consider that the moment of science is not about making science into a religion. Science and religion are very different things after all. Science deals with objective evidence, perceptions that don't depend on who's doing the perceiving. Machines can gather that sort of evidence for us, and there's perhaps no better example of this than all those things up on Mars right now. Yet there is, and there has to be, an element of the subjective when the objective information is looked at by human beings. Now it's going into a human brain, and nobody else can see what's going on in that human brain. They can describe it and so forth, but you don't really know for sure. And this is why science works better when it's a cooperative effort. So that someone seeing, for example, a face on Mars, you get other people to come and say, whoa, wait a minute, you're off there. And hopefully they convince us that we're wrong when we're wrong. Hopefully they'll convince us that we're wrong when we're right, like Einstein and the cosmological constant.
Is that face, is that real picture?
Yeah.
Oh, it's just the way it formed.
Just the way the crevices and stuff and the way the light hit that formation.
Yeah.
So, hey, you know, saw a face on a cloud the other day too.
It's fun, yeah.
Right.
Or aliens, it's all aliens, right?
Yeah, that's what it's World UFO Day.
Is it really?
It is.
Oh, yeah.
So by the time the public learns of scientific discoveries, the evidence has often but not always been filtered through. Lots of minds of many people involved in those studies, and the scientists themselves engage in discussion and debate on what Richard Feynman called bending over backwards to use his exact words, bending over backwards to show how maybe you're wrong. And when it seems that something new really has been found out, that maybe you're most likely an idea or an explanation could be right. Because in science, we never know for sure. There's no absolute. Something else could come along and get disproved. But when we have a deeper understanding of the world and how it works, that's the point of our moment of science, is that we can then experience that sense of awe, wonder about things that are really more wonderful and more profound, more joyous than any divine revelation. Think of the difference between the idea of an object displacing an equal volume of water when you immerse it, and Archimedes running naked through the streets of Syracuse shouting, "Eureka!" And that's our sacrament, if there is one, is that sense of, oh my gosh, that's the way it is. And you can have that over and over again as you consider different things, and even the same thing. And so with Mars, scientifically, the space missions around amount to the exploration of Mars, and in human experiential terms, it's the conquest of Mars. It's the difference between success and winning. So we're going to watch a short video that summarizes the last 20 years of NASA's, as they're putting in 24/7 presence at Mars, with an obvious emphasis on the winning and not just the successful missions. And this is something that every American, every inhabitant of the earth can be proud of, moved by, and inspired by. So hopefully this computer will allow me to toggle over to what I need to be at. they got some pretty good special effects there, I think. Well, maybe they had somebody actually down on the surface filming that. Notice how that, you know, curiosity, I mean, it's the size of a car. You're not going to put that in a balloon or just drop it on the surface. So they had this technology where it comes down with a chute device, lowers it while they're firing the retro rockets, and then cables are cut and the top portion flies away and gets rid of itself. Very inventive. It's kind of a little diary of how things were figured out. Let me turn on one of these lights so I can see a little bit up here. It's not what I have to do. And that's just okay, there's a video. Here's all the other craft that are there. It's not just us, not just NASA trying to explore Mars. So, and that was just the after the last 20 years, just all kinds of stuff we've sent there. Yes. Yes, please.
For those of you who aren't in the know, my son is Deputy Director of Medical Services for NASA. As such, he is positioned to know a great deal about this, but specifically about the medical aspects of getting people to Mars. And what we're going to try to do, and what's holding the game up, is trying to get a type of vehicle that will carry at least 3 people and keep them healthy for about 2.5 years. And the reason for that is it takes about 2 years to get there. And they've only got a 3-week window to pick the orbiter back up and come back to the United States or to this world. So they've got a problem of really the logistics of getting there and getting back home healthy. Because if they miss that window, they've got to stay on Mars for another 2 years before the window is back. And the window I'm talking about is the time that Mars and the Earth are fairly close to each other. It's about 2.5 weeks long. So I just thought I'd give you a little side.
That's cool. And I think they're also looking to some of the early studies of what happened when they sent people to Antarctica who had the winter over, because it's not just what happens to your body physically, but psychologically. It's extremely, I mean, you think you could sit in a capsule for 2 years with, you know, 2 other people?
Yeah, you've got to be somewhat compatible with somebody
yeah.
in a Volkswagen for 2.5 years.
But when I visited Antarctica, which I was fortunate enough to do years ago, there was one station you go by and the whole place is burned out. Because one of the people there decided they really wanted to go home, and the only way they're going to be able to do it is to get rescued. So he set fire to the base. Yeah. All right, so our subject, religious liberty. As I said earlier, most Americans seem to think religious liberty was made in America. So certainly Rhode Island's Roger Williams, this guy. And Pennsylvania's William Penn get a lot of the credit. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, respectively. By the way, William Penn was also among the earliest people to propose that the colonies unify into a single nation. And he also said that the European nations should get together in a union and have a European Parliament back in the 1700s. Well, the story goes that these and many others experienced religious persecution in Europe and resolved to establish communities that respected religious freedom. And this is true in part. In fact, the other side, to think about this, they were really kind of like, of their day, the kind of Jim Jones and followers that went down to British Guiana, you know, to set up utopia. Fortunately, it turned out better for our ancestors here in America than it did for the Jim Jones people. And because Kool-Aid hadn't been invented yet. Not a very good joke, I suppose. But these were, I mean, these people that came to America, they were considered the nutcases. A little bit later, I'll mention that a lot of people in Europe were glad to get rid of them. So they came to America to enjoy religious freedom for themselves, but only for themselves. The persecution they endured in Europe, they practiced against others when they got here. And to be fair, hardly anyone, though, then thought that it was possible, or at least desirable, to have it any other way, because the experience in Europe had been that religious diversity, any kind of heterodoxy, Any kind of nonconformity led to conflict and war. England, for example, had experienced the establishment of the Anglican Church in 1538 by Henry VIII, then reunification with Catholicism in 1555. How many knew that? Under Henry's daughter, Catholic Bloody Mary, and then separation again under Elizabeth, another daughter of Henry, in 1570. So all during these years, people are getting whipsawed with who's the bad guy and who we're going to persecute and so on. So by 1689, John Locke could credibly write these words: What power can be given for the suppression of an idolatrous church which may not in time and place be made use of to the ruin of an orthodox one? And there's some ... there, ellipsis, because he was also saying, what's orthodox to one people, one person is going to be heterodox to another. Everybody's an orthodoxy as far as they're concerned. And he says, if therefore such a power be granted unto the civil magistrate and spirituals, as that is Geneva, for example, he may extirpate by violence of blood the religion which is there reputed idolatrous. By the same rule, another magistrate in some neighboring country may oppress the Reformed religion, and in India, the Christian. So, people were starting to get the idea that maybe religious diversity was not what they thought. He also said that if it be once permitted to introduce anything into religion by the means of laws and penalties, there can be no bounds. It will in the same manner be lawful to alter everything according to the rule of truth, which the magistrate has framed unto himself. Well, of course, that goes too far. It's like saying if we allow the government to require automobile makers to reduce emissions to a certain amount, then pretty soon everybody's going to have to be driving Flintstone mobiles, right? Because it's zero emissions. And in just looking for a graphic to put up on this particular slide, I found this. People actually made the Flintstones, real versions of these Flintstone cars. That's like a piece of concrete for the front, but just the same as that. They made it pretty close. Crazy. So it is an area of contention, though, some people insisting that they should have the right to refuse to sell or rent or provide services to people and so forth, and more about that in a moment, too. But this was truly a new idea, that maybe the problems with conflict over religion is not so much that the civil authorities try to enforce conformity to one religion or another, that because there are too many nonconformists, maybe really the problem is that there are really not enough religious nonconformists. And Voltaire, who famously had to flee France or spend some more time in the Bastille for a while, he put it after living in England where he made his fortune, and it was 1733 by the time this appeared. If there were only one religion in England, there would be danger of tyranny. If there were two, they would cut each other's throats, Anglicans versus Catholics. But there are 30 and they live together happily in peace. I think Voltaire made an even more trenchant observation, also in 1733. Go into the Exchange in London, that place more venerable than many a court, and you will see representatives of all the nations assembled there for the profit of mankind. There the Jew, the Mohammedan, and the Christian deal with one another as if they were of the same religion and reserve the name of infidel for those who go bankrupt. And this is a key to another way to look at these questions. Back in September of 2012, we had a church service on the economics of religion. Just an absolutely fascinating subject of the many ways in which religion can be compared to other goods and services that people consume, or as the economists put it, to maximize their utility. This is a book I read at the time and I recommend to you if you're interested. It's really worth a read. It is kind of a little off the beaten track of other kind of books that atheists read, but very interesting for the reasons I just alluded to. So as Voltaire is writing of Christians, Jews, and Muslims doing business together in London in 1733, clearly by the time of Madison and Jefferson, there were reasons to accept the reality of religious pluralism. Economic activity, trade, and commerce, that was a big one. All the cogent arguments for freedom of conscience that we associate with the founders, all these wonderful quotes that we love, they were certainly welcome and needed, and we certainly appreciate them even today, but people were already receptive to them. Madison and Jefferson's ideas would probably not have fared very well had they come up with them a few hundred years earlier. And they wouldn't fare very well now in modern day Saudi Arabia, Iran, or even today's Turkey or Malaysia. So what changed in Europe? Something important was happening in the years leading up to the Reformation. Martin Luther was not the first to find fault with the Catholic Church. Well before Luther's 14th centuries before the church finally managed to exterminate them. And in fact, we don't know as much about them as we'd like because they stacked them all out. And then also the Waldensians, who followed the teachings of Peter Waldo. You ever heard of him? Right? Where's Waldo? He was excommunicated in 1184 for objecting to the wealth of the clergy, condemning Catholic dogmas, including transubstantiation and purgatory. The Waldensians eventually merged into the Protestant movement after the Reformation. And then John Wycliffe there, a little almost halfway down there, often credited as the first to translate the Bible into English, though others had translated portions. He also found fault with the sale of indulgences, the sacraments, transubstantiation, and he said, England belongs to no pope. He was condemned to death in 1415, but guess what? He'd already died. So those who took up his cause were known as the Lollards, which also were eventually absorbed into Protestantism after the Reformation. And then Jan Hus, it's interesting that most people never heard of him. You know, they don't teach these kinds of things in school, not like who invented the cotton gin, which is so important. You know, we just have to know who invented the cotton gin with Eli Whitney. Huss was a Czech priest who was burned at the stake in 1415. He was the other guy that was sentenced when they sentenced Wycliffe. Huss's followers successfully defeated 5 consecutive papal crusades. Not all the crusades took place in the Middle East. Between 1419 and 1434, what became known as the Hussite Wars. So all this was going on in the years leading up to when the Reformation really started. It wasn't just something that started out of the blue. It's an open question as to why these splintering Christian movements gathered energy from the 12th century on. You know, what was happening at that time? I have looked and have not found a good study where somebody has really looked into it deeply, but by the time Luther became active, many secular authorities in Germany saw an advantage to be gained by declaring themselves Protestants and then seizing the church lands. So, gosh, a little bit of an economic interest there. And this certainly was a motivation for Henry VIII separating from the Catholic Church. It wasn't just about him wanting to have all those wives. And his setting up the Church of England gave him an additional power source and sources of revenue that he didn't have before. And the subsequent struggles between the Protestants, many of whom thought that reforms had not gone nearly far enough, they criticized him for not getting rid of more of the Catholic forms. So there was a great deal of conflict and bloodshed because of that, and that in turn was a motivation towards tolerance, especially for rulers who were interested in a healthy and productive nation that supplies a reliable source of revenue. Depopulation of their towns and having fewer taxpayers is not good for the rulers. So this invites the kind of economic analysis that I mentioned. This time religion can be viewed not as a consumer good, but as an activity that's important to public officials and public policy. And perhaps this is more important in an era where having the support of the public is important to, or even crucial to a regime's survival and success. With this way of looking at things, religious liberty or religious restrictions and persecution can be seen not so much as a matter of human rights and morality, which of course it is, but more simply as government regulation of a marketplace. In this case, it's the marketplace of the gods. Political scientist Anthony Gill has proposed, oh, and I should back up because this is the other book, also a very good read. He's a political scientist. He wrote this book like 2007, not that old. He's proposed that religious goods can be defined in operational terms as fundamental answers on the deep philosophical questions surrounding life. And he connects it to supernaturalism, but it doesn't need to be. A church or religious denomination produces these religious goods, and the religious marketplace is that social arena where they compete for members and resources. So, Gill proposes these axioms, or he's explaining what he takes to be true. The religious pluralism arises naturally as people prefer different religious goods. It would just be, I mean, that's as surprising as saying that some people want to go out to a Mexican restaurant one night, or that, you know, they prefer their favorite is Chili's or something, and other people rather, you know, they don't like that. They'd rather go some other place. So the same with religion. People have different preferences. So when you look at a population where everybody's of the same religion and goes to the same church, there's latent heterodoxy in there. Something's going on to keep it that way. Same as we say that when one company is the only company that sells widgets, they didn't get that way just because they make the best widgets. There's probably something going on with public policy that gives them that monopoly. Another axiom is that churches and denominations seek to spread their brand as widely as possible. Well, yeah, of course. Politicians are primarily interested in their political survival. They don't care about doing what's right. They want to be there next year. They want to collect their pension. Politicians seek to maximize revenues by promoting economic growth and minimizing civil unrest. Right? As we heard, the projections show the economy is going to grow by 3% a year, and other people say, no, it's not. We need to increase taxes. Of course, this is what they're interested in. So these are good axioms. And finally, that political leaders seek to minimize the cost of ruling. They don't want to be putting down rebellions all the time. That's expensive in more than just monetary terms. Then Gill has a variety of these propositions. There's a couple of three slides or so. First of all, hegemonic religions, right? Majority religions that have most of the people on their side prefer more regulation. They prefer less religious liberty. And when no single religion is hegemonic, each will tend to prefer less regulation. Gosh, we're kind of minority. What do we prefer? More regulation or less? Yeah, so it applies to us too. Politicians seek ideological compliance of the population, and there will be less regulation or more religious liberty when it fosters political survival, revenues, economic growth, and social stability. In other words, religious liberty has to be worth their time and trouble. They're not just going to do it because it's the right thing. Other things being equal, non-religious rivals to power increase the power of the religions. You see that, right? The strongest bloc here is the religious right and the religious political extremists. Doesn't look like the Unitarians exercise a lot of political power. Most of the other ones are secular. So who gets most of the power from the religious bloc? A hegemonic religion not associated with a non-religious political faction will have more influence, and regulation will tend to favor that religion. Got to think about that. A couple of negatives in there. Regulatory policy will favor a religion that is associated with a political faction in power, and punish a religion associated with a faction that is not in power. And Proposition 4C, if no religion has hegemony, regulations will tend not to discriminate among them. Competing religions reduces the bargaining power of each and lead politicians to curry favor with all. Kind of a technical way of stating Voltaire's observation. As a political faction becomes more secure, the bargaining power of religions associated with that faction wanes. You don't need the support of the religious group. They're not going to have much influence on you as they would otherwise. As politicians become more secure, enforcement of restrictions on religion becomes lax, right? Because the cost of governing, they want to minimize that. Why enforce laws that don't really have a lot of backing? And as enforcement of restrictions on religion becomes lax, religious pluralism grows. Huh? Pretty interesting, huh? So, religious liberty is a function of religious regulation determined by the interests of political leaders and religious leaders and groups. Anthony Gill's 2007 book examines then a variety of cases that illustrate his ideas. So he looks at the case of colonial America. There's just fascinating stuff in there about some of the stuff they used to do to people and what they had to do to get out of it, and certificates of being taxed for the churches and then getting a certificate of exemption, some of which the local authorities just say, we're not paying any attention to that, you pay up or you go to jail. Also the cases of Mexico and Latin America, where of course the Catholic Church exercised a great deal of power. And then Russia and the Baltics, where the Russian Orthodox Church, although the Baltics are much more diverse, so it makes an interesting comparison. Very fascinating book. Put it on your list if you have time. So just showing how the interests of political leaders and of these religions relate to one another under varying circumstances. Really a fascinating account, and it seems that an urgent need currently is to consider whether this view of religious liberty, this way of looking at it as a function of religious regulation, can be applied usefully in understanding, say, Muslim majority nations. I was really waiting for that. He doesn't really refer to Muslims too much except this minority. And you're sitting up there, right? Because Turkey is such a great example where it was really secular under Ataturk, and now it's kind of sliding back into fundamentalist whack-jobby type things. So, but in these Muslim nations, I mean, it's reasonable to ask, what is preventing a loosening of their severe religious restrictions? Islam, after all, is not a single sect, but one that is divided between the Sunni and the Shia. The Sunni and the Shia majority in Iran, certainly, and not as much in Iraq, but still a majority there. But neither denomination has the sort of ecclesiastical hierarchy of, say, the Catholic Church, or the Anglicans and Episcopalians, or even the Mormons. cost-benefit relationship maintains the highly restrictive religious regulation in Muslim-majority nations. And as I said, in the case of Turkey, which has been moving away from secularism, I would love it if somebody who's in Gill's school. In fact, he says this in the preface to his book, that a lot of things could be the subject of theses by students or others. So these are questions that may be very important to us as well, because religious liberty, if it depends less on philosophical and theological, atheological considerations, and more on the primary interests of political survival for politicians and the power and influence for religions that they see, which way can we expect the opportunity costs to go? And we worry about carbon dioxide, for example, causing a runaway greenhouse effect on our planet. Maybe we should understand better what might constitute a danger of a runaway course towards religious tyranny that the West only with great difficulty over many, many years found its way out of. I think it should not be a presumption that, oh, that's just natural with progress, that's what's going to happen, and the Muslims are just behind us. No. And in fact, before the service started, we were talking a little bit about this, and I said I wasn't going to mention it, but now I will. The Edict of Nantes in France, where they gave the Huguenots much greater religious liberty, they ultimately revoked it. So they went this way and then went back that way without the country's dominant religion changing. Now, an interesting tidbit from Gill's consideration of colonial America, the British government found it very useful to get rid of the troublemakers like the Puritans. Like I said, they were not, people didn't like them anyways. In fact, the Quakers, they wanted, simplicity was their big thing, but some of them would like go around without any clothes and not shower or bathe. I guess they had showers, but they didn't bathe or cut their hair. Just terrible. Trying to live simply, like God intended it. Be like the lilies of the field. But it served the political purposes of the British king and the Church of England, because these religious nonconformists, if they would move far away, then they're not going to be there agitating and causing problems. But at the same time, they're going to help the British interests in North America, because they had warm bodies going there to hold the land and keep the French out. Because that was very important to them. We think of Australia having been the dumping ground for British criminals and debtors, but to some extent the United States was also a safety valve for Great Britain and for some other European nations. But at one point, in fact in 1637, there were so many people that had left certain areas of England, driving down property values. It was really a problem in those areas, that the authorities began requiring that people apply for a license to emigrate. So they had a problem. And if you've ever read on the history of the Industrial Revolution, Gill doesn't mention this, but I've read about that. That's one of the things that drove the development of steam power and mechanized manufacturing processes. There was a scarcity of labor at that time. So that might have actually kick-started the Industrial Revolution. And then think of this. Although the United States had successfully revolted against its colonial masters, of course, the common culture and language created a strong bond between England and America. Would Britain have survived World War I, and especially World War II, if North America had been initially populated by, say, the Spanish, or the Italians, or the Germans? Yeah, talking about alternate history. Just spine-tingling thing to think about. So there are just so many fascinating and sometimes really eye-opening facts and circumstances that I came across in doing my readings to prepare for today's service. Another that was quite sobering was coming across this passage in the Online Catholic Encyclopedia. The Catholic system of the union of church and state, which has always been the church's ideal and has often been in great measure realized. Yeah, their fangs have not fallen out. They are the same as they always were, given the opportunity. And actually, Gill does talk about this when he talks about Mexico and Latin America, that when it suits the interests of the Catholic Church, it advocates for more religious liberty. When it enjoys hegemony, when greater restrictions work in its favor to hinder their religious rivals, then it encourages less religious liberty. So this subject really is an endless well, just so much here, much more than most atheists who read about, follow some of the things that the FFR puts out. Great organization, by the way, but boy, there's a whole lot more to it than what you may think. And I need to learn a lot more too. You're going to say, Ron?
Well, it brings to mind Constantine and Charlemagne.
Of course, yes. Be interesting, again, to use these propositions. Great job for sociology of religion graduates to analyze that whole persecuted, because that was definitely a whipsaw type of thing. And even the whole Middle East, before Muhammad came along and the conquest of that whole area by the Muslims, there were lots of different religions. Many, I mean, it was Akka of religious nonconformity and so forth. Not so today, so it does show that it could go one way or another. Anybody else with comment? How are we doing?
I just remember that,
Yes.
remember learning that Mecca, before it was invaded by Muhammad, was a multi-religious place of worship, and then it got destroyed, and the moon-shaped
Yeah.
was introduced.
And I think something similar happened in India, right? The Muslims came and really imposed Islam on large areas. And,
Yeah, it wasn't easy to impose. India historically been
yeah. And of course, Turkey was, at least a lot of the coastal cities were Greek. Thales of Miletus, I think Miletus was along the coast of Turkey. You know where Miletus is? Ancient? No, it's from Turkey.
West Coast, Miletus?
Yeah, the west coast, I'm sorry. Yeah, there is a east coast. I guess.
South of Israel.
Yeah. So Thales of Miletus, in case you're wondering what's he talking about now, that was the Greek guy who first came up with explaining the world without gods. And he had some odd things that sound odd to us today, but there's no other way to express it than he said that all things have gods in them. But what he meant by that is that things behave according to their own internal character, not because of outside influences of supernatural forces. Thales of Miletus, 700 BCE. Yeah. Good reading. You know, one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, but really, without him, we wouldn't have science today.
Tim, a very relevant topic in the news just this last couple of weeks is Republicans are trying to relax the rules on churches being nonprofit,
Yes.
supporting politicians.
Right. Well, we had this came up, Bryce is here as an attorney, so I thought maybe he knew more about it than me, but maybe I know more about it, but I'm just very superficially that this case that came out of Missouri where they had some kind of program to resurface playgrounds with like recycled tires or something like this. And one of the churches applied, yeah, we want that too. This is don't get it out. And the government authority said, no, your church, this is against our constitution, our state constitution, what it says right there.
Specific words that really applied very well. And that church sued and went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, hey, got to be freedom of religion.
You as a state cannot deprive people of their federal
right of freedom of religion. And I was saying that I really
need to go and see how Justice
Thomas decided, because in the Newdow case, he said that the 14th Amendment should not extend the religion clauses to the states. Because at the time that the religion clauses were even written, they protected the state churches that were done at the time. I think there were only like 5 or 6 states at that time. They all got rid of them. Massachusetts, the last in 1833. Up until 1833, they were taxing you to support the Congregationalist stuff there, whether you liked it or not.
You know, I find this, if they indeed, and I think they said it was okay for them to have the federal funds to put that playground.
Yes, that's exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. But now, you know, it's going to be a lot of other churches that they're not going to like, are going to want to have the equal right.
Yep.
And so then I'm curious as to how the outrage is going to be.
Right. Well, I was talking to someone else about this, and I said it's almost like the Cloward-Piven strategy when it comes to these churches and their tax exemptions. Now, we got our tax exemption. That's fine. Take advantage of it, but it's not like we're going to go and say we deserve it as a moral right. Anybody heard of this Cloward-Piven strategy? This is if you're a very far leftist type of person, it's a strategy to overload the government system of the social welfare net. You just got everybody who could possibly qualify in there to get benefits, it would break the system, and then you have the kind of revolution that they want to have, Marxist utopia. Well, it's the same kind of thing with these religious tax exemptions. If we open it all up, people are going to start seeing that's not a good thing. In Colorado, they had a referendum some years back on that they should tax the nonprofits. Not because, we just need to tax them to get more money, but they're supplying police and fire protection to all these nonprofits, not just religious groups, but the Olympics Committee, which is nonprofit, and all these others too. The referendum past, but we may see more of that. The more that they try to do that, the more people are going to think, well, why should they get everything for free?
Yeah,
Why should they be on welfare?
Yeah, I'm really have become against the exemptions for taxes, for churches, as far as taxes. Because look what the Mormons have done with that.
Yeah.
They have built their empire on not having to pay taxes on things that's relegated to the Mormon church.
Yep.
And so, you know, and we are suffering from it.
It's funny because this morning I came here too early and I wanted to get a cup of coffee, so I checked Yelp. And I went over and it was the, some kind of church over there, I forget. And the coffee place was inside of the church. And immediately I thought to myself, well, it's probably 4.5 stars because it's all these people who know the people, so they're not going to be mean, so the rating might be skewed. So I don't know how good the bean actually is. And then I thought about basically what you're bringing up, like because I remember with the Mormon church, there was even a case with like their coffee shops, but it actually they ended up getting something, but not everything, I don't recall. And just like with this case with the playground, I remember I read some kind of more in-depth analysis. It's very nuanced. It's not like you just get public funding, but it's creating a crack where there might not even be one at all.
Right. And actually, the churches, if they have unrelated business income, they're selling coffee, that's supposed to be taxed.
Right.
But on the other hand, if they just rent space to Starbucks or the Bean or something like that, and then Bean turns around and gives them a donation, not sure how.
Right. Yeah, you get a little muddy in the water.
Yeah. So there's all kinds of ways to cheapen the law. Do things, right? I have an attorney friend who's told me that the law is kind of like trying to find your way to find something in a dynamite factory at midnight, and your only source of light is a match.
I thought, what was that? You talked about them flooding the system? Is there some kind of
Yes, it's called Cloward Pivot, C-L-O-W-A-R-D, and the idea is with welfare because you have these social aid type of things, and if absolutely everybody who qualifies for that were to make use of it, it would break down.
Let me think of whenever the Church of Scientology got their tax exempt status from the IRS, and what a lot of what motivated that was, I think they brought like 2,000 lawsuits to the IRS.
Yeah.
And the IRS is like, well, we can't divert 70% of our resources to deal with 2,000 lawsuits, so they just
said, okay, you can have it. No, that's a good strategy. You know, if you're trying to fight something, break it, and find a legal, some kind of logistical way to do it. That's amazing. I haven't heard that story, but totally believable.
I think it's around. It may be less than that, but
Scientology, I heard that.
Yeah.
They broke down the IRS.
They're famously litigious and sue everybody who criticizes them. Although there's now a lot of great, a lot of that stuff is seeped out, Xenu and all this weird stuff that they believe. So a little bit hard to put that genie back in the bottle. One wonders how they're doing now with with wider appreciation of what they're really up to. Well, that's it for. I want you to really please think about that, giving you a couple of reading suggestions, but even if you don't take it, now you've got that little nugget of wisdom and a little bit different way to think about religious liberty, I hope, as just something that is looked at very pragmatically. And of course, we've long suspected that these televangelists and other people, do they really believe what they say? They do when they're paid to. Freethought is not free. We have these rainbow-colored boxes in the back of the room, and they're very hungry for your cash, your checks, your gold bullion, anything valuable, good, your negotiable bond. Just jam it in there. It will be put to good use, I promise you. We do, as I said, not pay anybody, but of course we have to pay for the hotel room here. We pay for our website maintenance and so on, and also we advertise in both major newspapers every month and the Saturday before the service. So look next time on a Saturday before the first Sunday. Why do we do that? Do we get a lot of people to show up because they see the ad in the newspaper on Saturday? Well, by golly, we're going to go there. I suspect not. But the purpose of it is not just to try to get people to come on and know about us. It's to let all the believers and all of the people who would never come here to see they're there. And we're not going away. Not anytime soon. Not while I'm here. So these are reasons to give us your money, and it all boils down to one thing: we can do together what none of us can do on our own. And as I say, do you think of something that could be done? In fact, we've had situations in the past where a member called up, even somebody that we didn't see a lot of, and said, "My kid in school, here's what they're doing. My goodness." Well, it's pretty easy for the church to contact the school and say, "We heard about this happening. It's bad. You should stop it." And then they say, "Who's complaining? Nobody's complaining." Well, we're not going to tell them who you are. We're just going to say, "This is bad. You got to stop it." I think that's one of the things that the FFR. How many know of that organization? It's in Wisconsin, the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It's a good organization. This is the radical atheist group that brings lawsuits, puts up billboards against religion and so forth. And they're always described as outside agitators, out-of-state radical atheists, and this kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is, they can do it without getting the slings and arrows that anybody close to the situation would if the person right there on the ground were to complain. So help us promote your values, and as Gandhi said, demonstrate your commitment by being the future that you wish to see. So go in the joy of reason, and next service we're going to have the finding one's way out of their religious weirdness, and I think that should be very fascinating. It's something that I've often wondering about as much as